thrilled to sit there and listen to him again today, but I'm happy to also address this subject. With all that's going on in the Middle East right now, there are all kinds of people who have all kinds of questions or thoughts about what that means as far as the end of time is concerned. And it's very, very common to read things like this: not in the lifetime of most men has there been so much apprehension. Never has the future seemed so incalculable as at this present time. The domestic economic situation is in chaos. Our dollar is weak throughout the world. Prices are so high as to be utterly impossible. The political cauldron seethes and bubbles with uncertainty. Russia hangs, as usual, like a cloud, dark and silent upon the horizon. It is a solemn moment. Of our troubles, no man can see the end. And this was published in Harper's Weekly, October 1857. What does that tell you? And what does it tell me? That forever and a day, people have been coming to the events in the Middle East and determining, oh no, this has to be it. This has to be it. Listen, as bad as things are over there, and we're sorry for all the human tragedy of the people that are being slaughtered, as bad as that is, this is the umpteenth time in a short period of time that people have said, oh, this has to be indication that the signs are just right for the end of the world to come, or for the millennial kingdom to be established. This is not a new thing, this idea of signs and date setting. Back in 1889, this is what the Jehovah's Witness organization would say, though they were not yet known by that name. This is that same group. The battle of the great day of God Almighty, which will end, they said in AD 1914, is already commenced. And in 1904, they said the stress of the great time of trouble, it'll be on us soon, somewhere between 1910 and 1912. The great crisis, they said, 1914, the great clash, it is very near. Armageddon may begin next spring. And then in 1915, the present great war in Europe is the beginning of Armageddon, they claimed. And then in 1922, when all of that was come and gone, they said, well, the date 1925 is even more distinctly indicated by the scriptures than 1914. And then in 1923, our thought is that 1925 is definitely settled by the scriptures. 1925, scriptures definitely fix the fact we may expect 1925 to witness the return of these faithful men, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by the way, they were convinced so much of this by their leader, Judge Rutherford, that he convinced them, it wouldn't be right for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to return and not to have a fantastic place in which to live. So they built a mansion for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so that when they came back in 1925, they could really enjoy it. When they didn't show up in 1925, Judge Rutherford essentially told them, well, it'd be a shame to let this mansion just go to waste, so I guess I'll just live here. And that's what happened. And it's still, by the way, if you go to San Diego, California area, Beth Sarim is still a marker that you can go and visit this location. Well, of course, they didn't come back in 1925. And 6 years later, they said there was a measure of disappointment on the part of Jehovah's faithful ones on earth concerning the years 1914, 1918, 1925. And for a while, they quit fixing dates, but then they came right back to it. 1941, Armageddon is surely near, soon, within a few years. 1946, Armageddon should come sometime before 1972. That gives you a little wiggle room there. Sometime before 1972, it's probably going to happen. And then they say now it's firmly maintained that by the autumn of the year 1975, the Battle of Armageddon will have been fought, God's new world will have been established, And then Errol Burton in 1969 put it this way. He said, now within months, or at the most 5 years, you notice all the wiggle room. These prophets that wrote by God's direction never did have to have such wiggle room, did they? They were writing exactly what God wanted. These individuals claimed, oh, the end of the world as we've known it will occur. 1,000-year reign of Jesus will begin. It happened over and over and over again, and it didn't happen. The sign setting happened, but the fulfillment never did. Now, what is the basis of all this anyway? It's a misunderstanding of Matthew 24, and I want you to consider the context of Matthew 24 as we begin this morning. You'll notice that Matthew chapter 23 is very important. Matthew did not versify and chapterize his original document and say, well, I'm going to call this Matthew 24 now. And so the words leading up to what we know as Matthew 24 are very significant, because what has just happened at the end of Matthew 23? Jesus has indicted the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites, as he called them in Matthew 23. And then he says to them in verse number 36, verily I say unto you, when he was talking about them receiving a punishment for the way they treated God's prophets, he said in verse 36, verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation, the generation to whom he was then speaking. And then he says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, watch this, your house is left unto you desolate. And right on the heels of that, we see verse 1 of chapter 24. Jesus had just told them their house. What house would that be, class? That's the temple. Jesus went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples want to show him how magnificent these buildings are. And Jesus said unto them in verse 2 of Matthew 24, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And that leads to some questions. Consider the questions. The questions are found in verse 3. As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? What things? What things has he just been saying? Your house is going to be left desolate, and not one stone will be left upon another that won't be thrown down. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. Now the disciples want to know when that's going to happen, and what shall be the sign of thy coming. And it seems logical that in their mind they would have equated such a catastrophic event with the end of the world. Jesus is going to divide up his answer into two sections and say, well, regarding the sign of the coming, regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, there will be the following. We'll see those in a moment. And then he says, but of that day and hour no man knows, as we'll see as he talks about the second coming, the end of the world. So consider now the warnings. Jesus in verse 4 says, you need to take heed that no man deceive you. What does that tell you? This chapter is very much in the field of those who would try to deceive, but that's not a new thing. That was happening back in that day and time. He didn't want them to be deceived. That's why verses 24 and 25 say, there shall arise false Christs, false prophets. They'll show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. Remember, he says, behold, I've told you this before, so now consider the signs. What signs would there be that the temple was about to be destroyed? In verses 5 to 15, the first thing he says is there are going to be many people coming and saying they're the Christ. Watch out for that. Number 2, look at verse 6. You're going to hear of wars, rumors of wars. Don't be troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end of what? The end of what he's just been talking about, the temple and the Jewish system. That's not going to be just right away when you hear of wars and rumors of wars. But those wars and rumors of wars will indicate to you that it's getting closer. Verse 7, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. What? Famines, pestilences, earthquakes in all kinds of different places, he says. All that's just the beginning of sorrows. Then they'll deliver you up. He's talking to his own apostles there, and they're going to deliver you up to be afflicted. They'll kill you. You'll be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Many will be offended, betray one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and deceive many. Deception. Notice the deception. Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world for a witness to all the nations. And after that has been accomplished, then shall the end come. The end of what? What is the context? The end of this temple that he's been talking about and the Jewish system that accompanied it. Now consider the fulfillments. If I can show you, if we can look together and find fulfillments for these signs that took place then in their day and time, then we don't need to look at everything happening today as the fulfillment of what's already been fulfilled. And that is what we want to show historically now. Josephus was a Jewish priest and historian, very familiar with the Jewish sects of the day, led a revolt, and of course the Romans captured him in 67 AD. He was held in Caesarea as a prisoner until 69 AD, and then he came to Jerusalem with Titus in AD 70 when Jerusalem's temple was destroyed. So he was actually an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem, and I want you to notice something that he wrote in his Wars of the Jews. He said in section 5 of that section, there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former. He was a cheat. He pretended to be a prophet also and got together 30,000 men that were, notice, deluded, deceived by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place. So true or false, Josephus acknowledges the existence of a false prophet that deceived, deluded 30,000 men to believe he was someone special. Yes, Jesus had warned this would happen. In the Antiquities of the Jews section of Josephus's history, he writes this: Now it came to pass that while Thaddeus was a procurator of Judea, a certain magician whose name was Theudas persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them, follow him to the river Jordan. He told them he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were what? Deluded by his words. What did Jesus say in Matthew 24 and verse 4? Take heed that no man deceive you. Many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. That deception was happening in the first century. We don't need for it to happen today to fulfill what's already been fulfilled. There was another historian by the name of Tacitus, and this is what he wrote regarding this rumors of war sign. He mentions and he was a Roman historian, by the way, he mentioned this as he's writing about first century history. Here's what he said: the history on which I am entering is that of a period rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell by the sword. There were 3 civil wars, more foreign wars, and often both of them were happening, he said, at the same time. Now, Luke has a parallel account to Matthew 24, and there's something that Jesus said in Luke's account that's not mentioned in Matthew's account. It certainly bears investigation. In Luke 21 and verse 11, he mentions the great earthquakes. Well, that had been mentioned in Matthew. Famines, pestilences, yes, that's also mentioned in Matthew. But then this: fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. And as you think about some statements that Josephus makes about things that were going on in the first century, mind you, he mentions these things that had happened that he described were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men when the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess these wonders foreshadowed some great calamities that were coming. Well, bingo. Jesus had said before the calamity of the destruction of the temple takes place, there will be calamities taking place, and he said there would be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. Josephus also writes this: the people of Caesarea had slain the Jews among them on the very same day and hour when the soldiers were slain, which one would think must have come to pass by the direction of providence, insomuch that in 1 hour's time above 20,000 Jews were killed, and all Caesarea was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants. Now think about that. As tragic as the events of recent days have been and continue to be, if you'd had news crews back then keeping documentation of a time when 20,000 Jews were killed in about an hour's time and all Caesarea is emptied of Jewish inhabitants, there were some things going on then that were indeed remarkable as well. We don't need to wait for the 21st century to find those kinds of things. Now, what about these famines? Do we have any famines in the first century that can be documented that would fulfill Jesus' predictions? Josephus says of Queen Helena, now her coming was of very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem, for whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to produce food withal, Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexandria with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others she sent to Cyprus to bring a cargo of dried figs. Now, I mentioned Tacitus to you earlier. Listen to what he writes about famines in the first century. Many prodigies occurred during the year. Ominous birds took their seat on the Capitol. Houses were overturned by repeated shocks of what? Earthquake. And as the panic spread, the weak and they were trampled underfoot in the trepidation of the crowd. A shortage of corn, again. What does that imply? This is not the first famine we've had to deal with, he says. A shortage of corn again, and the famine that resulted, he writes, were construed as being so severe they were supernatural warning. Well, it is interesting that Jesus had given supernatural warnings that famines would precede something coming. And this matches up with what inspired. Now, Josephus not inspired, Tacitus not inspired, Luke inspired. Does Luke mention any famine in the first century that would be of note? In these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch. There stood up one of them named Agabus, signified by the Spirit, there should be great dearth throughout all the world. Did it happen? It came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. So if it happened then, do we need for it to be happening right now to fulfill Matthew 24? Or has Matthew 24 already been fulfilled in that first part of it? Now, what about these earthquakes? In his book called An Eschatology of Victory, a man by the name of J. Marcellus Kick wrote this. As far as earthquakes, many are mentioned by writers during a period just previous to 70 AD. There were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania, Rome, and Judea. It's interesting to note that the city of Pompeii was much damaged by an earthquake occurring on February 5th, 63 AD. Now, as far as these fearful sights and great signs from heaven that Luke records Jesus talking about, Josephus does note that in the first century there broke out a prodigious storm in the night with the utmost violence, very strong winds, the largest showers of rains, continual lightnings, terrible thunderings, amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. Thus, he says, also there was a star resembling a sword that he claims stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Now, I'm not saying that what he wrote is accurate to the point of absolute 100% certainty, but I am saying this, what Jesus said, fearful sights and great signs from heaven, you can be 100% sure that would happen. And so if Josephus is writing about signs from heaven and fearful things being seen that wouldn't be out of kilter with what Jesus said in Luke 21 and verse 11, He said before the Jews' rebellion, so great a light shone round about the altar in the holy house, it appeared to be bright daytime, and that light lasted for half an hour. The eastern part of the gate, he said, was of brass. It was very heavy, armed with iron, vastly heavy, with difficulty shut by 20 men, rested upon a basis with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor. Made of one entire stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night, is what he writes. And so, were there things going on in the first century that would have matched up with what Jesus said would have to happen before the destruction of the temple could happen? Yes, but he also said the gospel would have to be preached in all the world before the end of the Jewish temple could come. And when we read these passages, Paul writes in Colossians 1, 5, and 6 of the gospel, which is come unto you as it is in all the world. Then he mentions in Colossians 1:23, the gospel which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Does Paul acknowledge the distribution of the gospel to all the regions of the world? He does. And now Mark's account says you're going to be brought before rulers and kings. Do we see any of the apostles being brought before rulers and kings prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD? Peter and John in Acts 4, Stephen in Acts 7, James in Acts 12, Paul's before Gallio in Acts 18, Felix in Acts 24, King Agrippa in Acts 25, and then finally allowed to present his case before Caesar himself. So were they brought before rulers and kings? Yes, sign fulfilled. But here's one of the most significant ones as far as knowing for sure that you're about to see the destruction of Jerusalem take place. It's called the abomination of desolation. I want to go to Matthew's account first, Matthew 24. And note that Jesus says in verse 15 of Matthew 24, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Let him understand what? Luke helps us here. In Luke's account in Luke 21, you can't miss this. Luke chapter 21 and verse number 20. By the way, to show you this is the same context, go to the beginning of the chapter and you'll notice in verse 5 of Luke 21, what were some speaking about and bragging about? The temple and how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. And what did Jesus say as they were talking about how magnificent the temple was and the complex surrounding it? As for these things which you behold, Luke 21:6, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. They want to know when. Verse 7, when's that going to happen? Watch verse 20 of Luke 21. When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know. What could they know when they saw Jerusalem compassed with armies? They could know what? The desolation of it was near. It was nigh. And then when you see that, you need to get out. You need to flee to the mountains, he said in verse 21 of Luke 21. Let them in the midst of it depart out. Don't come into the city if you're outside of the city already. And so, look, recently a preacher I was with told me about a post he saw on Facebook. They showed picture of some folks doing military things surrounding Jerusalem, around the environs of Jerusalem, and they put Luke 21:20 in their post and says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, and then they put a picture of like Jerusalem today being, surrounded by folks that were trying to do them in. And they indicated in their post that this is what Luke 21:20 was talking about. Let me ask you something. If there had been cameras stationed around Jerusalem in 70 AD, in the months leading up to 70 AD, would those cameras have detected the amassing of troops surrounding the city of Jerusalem in that day and time? Yes or no? Absolutely, yes. Do you and I need armies to be surrounding Jerusalem today for us to think, what Jesus said is going to happen is about to happen? Or can we look at it and say, hey, wait a minute. This already happened. Jerusalem was already surrounded with armies. And their desolation that was predicted has already happened. We don't need to wait for it to happen today. So watch what Josephus writes about all of this as it matches up with the tribulation and trouble and trial going on there in Jerusalem. Now, when the multitude were gotten together to an assembly, and everyone was in indignation at these men seizing upon the sanctuary, at their rapine and murders, but had not yet begun their attacks upon them, Agnes stood in the midst of them, casting his eyes frequently at the temple, and having a flood of tears in his eyes, he said, certainly it had been good for me to die before I'd seen the house of God full of so many what? Abominations. Or these sacred places that ought not to be trodden upon at random, filled with the feet of these blood-shedding villains. When you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, know the abomination of desolation is about to take place, and that's exactly what is being described here. And Luke says, now Vespasian, I should say, Josephus says as he corresponds with what Luke 21:20 talks about, surrounded by Roman armies. Josephus contributes this: Vespasian had fortified all the places round about Jerusalem, erected citadels at Jericho and Adida, and placed garrisons in them both. Now the war having gone through all the mountainous country and all the plain country, those that were at Jerusalem were deprived of the liberty of going out of the city. They were sieged to where they couldn't just come and go as they pleased. Now notice, as Vespasian was returned to Caesarea and was getting ready with all his army to march directly to Jerusalem, he was informed that Nero was dead. So he put off at first his expedition against Jerusalem and stood waiting whether the empire would be transferred after the death of Nero, the Roman Empire being then in a fluctuating condition, and did not go on with the expedition against the Jews, which matches up with Jesus' statements about there being a time for his people to get out. When the legions of Rome finally got to Jerusalem, they camped at the Mount of Olives. And immediately after their arrival, no wonder Jesus says, when you see this, get out and get out right now. Because watch what happens historically after the Roman armies got there. A 9-mile long wall was constructed in 3 days that totally enclosed the city. And Josephus then tells how Roman soldiers went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn. They slew those whom they overtook without mercy. They set fire to houses where the Jews were fled and burnt every soul in them and laid waste a great many of the rest. And they came to a number of houses to plunder them, but they found inside of those houses entire families of dead men, upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine, and then stood in horror at this sight. They went out without touching anything. These people had starved to death inside those houses because of the siege. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, they didn't have the same for those still alive. They ran everyone through whom they met with and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, made the whole city run down with blood to such a degree, indeed, the fire of many houses was quenched with these men's blood. If there had been news and camera crews there to document the carnage, it wouldn't be so hard for some people to understand this stuff that Jesus says is going to happen before the destruction of the Jewish temple already has happened. Now, I want you to consider the language here in Matthew 24. In Matthew 24 and verse 29, look at the statement that is made there. Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And I remember in my early days of preaching, I remember reading this and thinking to myself, well, that's so catastrophic, it has to be the end of time. That has to be the fulfillment of the final coming of our Lord. But then I learned better. Here's what I want to ask you. has language like this on the screen in your Bible? Has language like that ever been used to describe a judgment from God against a nation without it being the final judgment of all time? Has that ever happened in Scripture? And when you and I take our Bibles and start just doing a quick survey, consider apocalyptic language. It does not always connote the end of the world in total. It denotes a catastrophic end to the people under target and mention. Babylon, for example. Isaiah 13:1 is definitely not a judgment prediction against the whole world. It was about Babylon, the burden of Babylon. So a day of the Lord, a judgment day from God, was at hand for Babylon. It will come, he says, as a destruction from the Almighty. Now, in particular, look at this. See if this sounds familiar. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth. The moon shall not cause her light to shine. Isaiah 13:10. That was written specifically about Babylon's destruction and demise. Even though the language seems to be so catastrophic, it would have to be the end of the world. Sometimes in the context, it's confined to the target of the judgment. In this case, it was Babylon. Therefore, I'll shake the heavens. The earth will remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger. So that's, well, okay, is that just a one-off though, or is this happen other places too? Here's Edom. Different judgment, similar language. Watch this. Is Isaiah 34:4 and following. When it comes to the destruction of Edom, watch this. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved. The heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down. He goes on to say, this judgment will come upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment. And then you get to a passage that talks about the peoples in general. This is Isaiah 51:5 and 6. As you describe the peoples of that day and time and the judgment that would come upon them, what do you have? Watch the middle of the word, the middle of the screen there. For the heavens shall vanish away like smoke. The earth shall wax old like a garment, and they that dwell therein shall die in like manner. This is not describing the final judgment, but it's describing it, a judgment with similar language that we've seen in other places. Judah, what about you? When he tells Judah that God's going to put their lights out, the heavens, they had no light. He says in Jeremiah 4, for this shall the earth mourn, the heavens above will be black, because I've spoken it, I've purposed, I'm going to turn your lights out, and I'm going to bring you to judgment. What about Egypt in Ezekiel 32:7 and 8? What does he tell Egypt? When I put you out, how does he describe how he would do that to Egypt? I'll cover the heaven, make the stars dark, cover the sun with a cloud, the moon won't give her light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee. That is the way God tells people that he's bringing a judgment upon them, and it does not always demand the end of time judgment. In fact, in these cases, these were individual judgments against nations, and the world continued to stand after these nations were punished and destroyed by God as he promised he would. The book of Joel has similar language regarding nations that would be judged. Sun and moon darkened, stars would draw their shining, heavens and earth shall shake. You see, Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, is also the target of Nahum, the book of Nahum chapter 1. Look at what he says to them in Nahum 1 near the end of that section, verses 1 through 5. The mountains quake at him, the hills melt, the earth is burned at his presence. Jerusalem in Matthew 24:29. The sun will be darkened, the moon won't give her light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. True or false? That language has been used numerous times in Scripture to describe a particular judgment upon a particular people from God. Yes or no? You've seen it. So when we get to Matthew 24:29, we say, okay, this is apocalyptic language such as the Jews were very familiar with. It was all through their Old Testament sections there and the prophets. So they would have understood the catastrophic nature of this, and it would not have necessarily been the end of all time. It would have been the end of the temple's time and the system that was associated with it. Now, in the last few minutes that we have, let's consider the contrasts. The contrast between judgment number 1 in Matthew 24 and the final judgment day in Matthew 24. When it comes to the destruction of Jerusalem, you'll notice that he uses the word days in the plural. Look at verse 19 of Matthew 24. Woe unto them that are with child and to them that give suck or nurse babies in those days. Stop. Why would, if this is talking about the end of time, the second coming of our Lord to set up his shop on earth, tell me why it would be not so good to be a nursing mother during that time period. What difference would it make, verse 20, whether it was winter? Verse 20 says, pray that your flight's not in the winter, nor on the Sabbath day. Well, the Sabbath day is no longer in force, so why would it matter whether it's the Sabbath day or not if this is talking about something way off in the future or something that's about to happen right now? Why would it be best not to be a nursing mother or to be a pregnant mother during that time? Well, let me ask you, if you take this and apply it to the destruction of Jerusalem, what did he tell them? The moment you see the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, what do you need to do right away? Flee to the mountains. I'm not trying to be crass or crude here. I'm just asking, is it easier to flee when you're not pregnant or when you are pregnant? Is it easier to flee when you're not nursing a baby, a small child, and having to take care of its needs and run with safety for that child? Is it easier to run when you're not nursing a baby or you are nursing a child and it's dependent on? Is it easier to run on icy conditions or warmer conditions? So if you're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem physically back then, a regional, local judgment. Notice verse 16 of Matthew 24. Then let them which be where? Flee into the mountains. In Judea. This is very limited. Notice now when you get to the second coming of Christ, we go from days, plural, to day. Verse 36. After he's described the destruction of Jerusalem and all that would happen prior to it, he then says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. He said it's going to be like the days of Noah. Did they know a flood was coming in the days of Noah? Yes. Did they have a weatherman that was on there showing them the approaching storm? No. They had no idea as to the exact time that it would come. There were no visible signs that it was getting closer. It was just something that they knew was coming but did not know when it would come. Jesus says you can know when the destruction of Jerusalem is about to happen, when the Roman armies are outside of it. But on this occasion, with reference to the second coming, verse 42 of Matthew 24, watch, you don't know what hour your Lord's coming. Look at verse 50. The Lord of that servant will come in a day when he's not even looking for him. With the destruction of Jerusalem, he says, look for this, look for this, look. When you see this, you'll know. But the final coming, he says, it's going to come when you're not necessarily even looking for it. And then chapter 25:13, which is connected to this section, watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. Now this is interesting. With reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, they could know. In fact, he says in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation, and what does Luke 21:20 teach us, class? That would be seen when they saw what? The Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. Luke 21:20 would be the sign that this is about to happen. When you see that, then you know, understand. He says, let him understand. Let him know. Know what? Know what it means. Look at verse 33 of Matthew 24. So likewise, when ye shall see, you can see, all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. So they could know. But then have you noticed the contrast? When we got to the final day, they know not. They don't know. If the good man of the house had known when the thief was coming, he would have watched and he wouldn't have allowed his house to be broken into. Verse 44 of Matthew 24, therefore be ye also ready in such an hour as you think not the Son of Man cometh. And so you can know. But then you cannot know when the second coming is going to happen. You could know it if you were in Jerusalem, you wouldn't know. Now, would there be times of crisis? You wouldn't know if it was the end of time. Times of crisis, Matthew 24, 4 to 13. It's going to be wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, pestilences, famines, all these things. But interestingly, when it comes to the final coming, normal times. Like the days of Noah. What were they doing in the days of Noah prior to the coming of the flood? Verse 38, in the days that were before the flood, there were all these signs that it was about to happen. That's not what the Bible says, is it? What were they doing in the days before the flood? Normal, everyday things, eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. How long were they doing that? Until the very day that Noah entered the ark, it was all normal. So, destruction of Jerusalem, crisis. The final judgment, no evidence that it's about to happen, no crisis that makes you think, oh, it's got to be close now. It'll be like in the days of Noah. Everything's normal until it happens just like that. Now, here's the one in Matthew 24, 32 and 33 that is one of the most powerful evidences this had to happen before that generation died. Look at verse 32 of Matthew 24. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. What does he say? The parable of the fig tree. When the branch puts forth his leaves, you know something. You know summer's getting close. You know summer is nigh. Likewise, when you see all these things, know that it's near, even at the door. But with reference to the final judgment, there are no warning signs. With reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, there would be time to flee. Matthew 24:16. But according to Matthew 24:39, the flood came and took them all away. In Noah's day, they didn't have time to run away and get away. It was a global flood anyway that would not have done them any good to try to get away, but there's no way they would have been able to have any time to get away anyway. The judgment was limited to Jerusalem and its local area. It's a universal judgment that we read about in Matthew 25. And here it is. I want to close without events would occur within that generation. Look at verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Consider the time lock that Jesus just put on the first part of Matthew 24. He says this generation would not pass. What does that mean? The sum total of those born at the same time expanded to include all those living at a given time and frequently defined in terms of specific characteristics. And this is from Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich's Greek lexicon, and it even includes Matthew 24:34 as the commentary, as a passage that deals with this definition. So those who were living at that time would not die before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple took place. Finally, these last two items. If you look at the second coming of Christ there on the second one up from the bottom, the event would be delayed from the immediate time. In fact, it's interesting, right after he starts discussing the second coming, he says something about the Lord of that servant going away for a long time and then coming back in a day when he's not aware of. And then you see also in Matthew 25, the virgins are waiting and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and then the bridegroom finally shows up. And then the Roman armies outside of Jerusalem before destruction, visible sign, last statement, no visible sign precedes the second coming event, Luke 21, 34 and 35. He said it's like a trap, a snare. You don't know it's there, and then boom, it strikes when you're not even aware it's about to. If you are so interested, I'll be happy to provide a PDF of all this and email it to anyone that wants a copy of it. And I'm sorry I had to go so fast. I wasn't sure if I could get it all in. Thank you all.